Chapter 6. Ayianna's eyelids flew open. Her heart hammered. Where was she? What happened? Her brother's severed head flashed in her mind. It all came rushing back. The guard, the old elf, the horses. Her chest constricted. She bolted upright. Her head spun and a wave of nausea twisted her stomach. A rough wool blanket fell from her shoulders. A small fire crackled and popped. Its shifting light revealed a man. No, an elf reclining against a tree. It was Saeed, and across from him sat Kale. They had survived, and an intense urge to grab their necks and kiss them swept over her, but fled just as quickly as guilt slammed into her. They could have died because of her. Kale lifted his gaze to meet hers. His gray eyes drew her in and chilled her. Currents of sorrow swirled behind his icy glare like rivers in winter. He turned away. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and inched closer to the orange flames. The heat warmed her face, but not the hollowness of her soul. Closer still she inched, until her skin burned. If only they'd consume her and purge the memory of her brother, her father, and the sorrow threatening to drown her. She didn't want to remember Dagmar, or the words they had shared. She didn't want to think any more. Instead, she wished to shrink away into the darkness and disappear. Numbness seeped across her body like the north wind passing over the waterways, freezing and hardening. "Ayianna?" Saeed tugged the braids of his soiled beard. His lined face could have belonged to any grandfather as he sat there, absorbed in his thoughts and in the glow of the fire. Still, he was probably much older than any grandfather she had ever known. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I have felt better." She drew her knees to her chin and wrapped the blanket around them. "What happened back there?" "They attacked. We fought," Kale said as he whittled away on a stick. "Why did you run?" Ayianna looked back into the dying fire. "I had thought, well, with so many and only two of you." "You were afraid they would find you." Saeed's amber eyes were gentle but weary. "Why were they after you?" She hesitated. She detected no ill will or anger from him. Still, her father had his reasons for keeping secrets. But what should she tell him? It wasn't like she knew the secrets her father harbored, and she didn't even know if they were connected. But Saeed was a guardian. "They killed my father." Kale glanced up from his whittling. "They didn't want him dead, though." She twisted the blanket in her hands, not wanting to go on. The silence lengthened. Both Saeed and Kale watched her, their eyes glimmering in the firelight. She took a deep breath. "After they had attacked, my father told me to find my brother. They must have followed me." "Why?" Saeed asked. "They were supposed to kill me, not my father." "It doesn't make sense." Kale threw the stick into the fire. "They don't sound like regular thieves to me." Saeed ran his hand along his beard. "I agree. Ayianna, do you remember anything more? Did they say why they were looking for your father?" She closed her eyes and tried to remember. "One of them said, 'Kill the girl and keep him alive.' Someone wanted him. That was it. I don't remember much else, except that they had been looking for my father, and that after they had The words stuck in her throat. She took a deep breath. "They started calling each other names and arguing." "If they wanted him alive," Kale said as he studied Ayianna, "then most likely he knew something they wanted to know." "But I don't know anything that someone would kill for." "I'm sure your father didn't trust you with all of his secrets." She glared at the guard, too stunned and hurt to reply. "Time will reveal all things." Saeed's gaze passed from Kale to her. Could he read her mind? She dug in her pocket for her mother's talisman, but guilt pierced her as she remembered her father's admonishment. She opened her mouth to say something, but Kale held up his hand. He rose to his feet and drew his sword, his eyes scanning the forest. Patches of moonlight seeped through the trees and bathed the long wispy grass in an icy blue gleam. A rustling of branches and grass whispered beyond their campsite. Ayianna held her breath. Were there more thieves and murderers? She glanced around. Saeed sat against a tree, his eyes closed. What was he doing? She started to stand, but the guard shook his head. She strained her eyes to form objects out of the shadows. A silver wolf sinked into view. "Liam!" Warmth flooded her grieving soul, and a wave of fresh tears coursed down her cheeks. Liam bounded through the campsite and bowled her over. Ayianna buried her face in the wolf's thick fur, hiding her tears. "Ayianna," Saeed said. She lifted her head and dried her face with the edge of her skirt. Her raw skin burned against the raw fabric. Saeed stood next to her and touched her forehead. "We must go." "Right now?" "Yes." Kale rolled his blanket up and stashed it in his pack. "We must reach Badara at daybreak." She dropped her hands in her lap. "I don't think I can go another step on foot." "Then it's a good thing we have horses. Their owners won't be needing them anymore," Kale replied. His somber face didn't reflect the dry humor lacing his words. He dipped into the shadows and returned with 3 horses, a roan and 2 sorrels. The last shades of night faded into an early morning haze as Ayianna, Saeed, and Kale reached Badara. Square towers and battlements rose up from behind the large walls of Badara. Soldiers stood along the top of the wall with their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, watching the coming and the going beneath them. Green banners fluttered atop the towers. Perhaps Dagmar had only been a nightmare. Ayianna urged her horse on, following Saeed and Kale through the swarm of activities. Merchants and farmers poured through the gates and organized their goods for market. Little donkeys pulled heavy carts laden with fresh produce and various grains. Farmers herded animals of all kinds into wooden pens outside the white walls of Badara. Bleating of sheep and goats, neighing of horses, and braying of donkeys filled the morning air. Was it always so busy in Badara? So many different people from all over Nalu converged along the road between vendors and into the city. Elves and dwarves, dark-skinned and light-skinned, all mingling with the humans. Such a contrast from Lord Ramiro's manor in neighboring villages. Hadn't Lord Ramiro said Desmond was in Badara? She scanned the crowds for him, but then shook her head. He wouldn't be outside with the smell of the cattle and fowl. He was a draper of expensive cloths and hides. Could she even find him among so many people? Perhaps it would be better if she didn't. Ayianna followed Kale and Saeed through Badara's large gatehouse. Sharp spikes of the iron portcullises hung overhead, and small slits in the wall glared at her. She shivered and pressed her heels against the horse's sides. They weaved their way through the growing crowd. Cramped stone buildings lined the narrow cobblestone street. Wooden signs dotted windows, advertising herbs, trinkets, or vacancies. The sweet smell of cinnamon and yeasty breads hinted at a bakery nearby, but barely masked the odor of hay and manure. They approached the merchant square, and Ayianna glanced around, trying to see everything at once. Not even Zuriel could boast such a varied mix of nations and merchandise. To her right, an elderly woman sold colorful woven scarves, smocks, and kirtles. A dwarf across the street sold iron tools and weaponry. Farther in, an elf adjusted the jewelry rack after making a sale. Ahead, a skinny elf with mahogany-colored skin paraded several beautiful horses around a corral. Muscles rippled under their polished coats, boasting of strength and speed. "Those are the Nisads, the fastest horses in Nalu. They ride like the wind." Kale reined in his mount next to hers. "They are beautiful. Where are they from?" "The Zarayab Desert," Saeed said. A small smile creased more wrinkles into his bronze skin. "The Sarahemor elves raised them." He turned his horse away and continued up the cobbled street. Kale leaned in his saddle toward Ayianna. "He is a desert elf and proud of it." Ahead, Saeed wove his horse between clusters of shoppers who chatted away like chickens at feeding time. The hair on top of his head had thinned enough to expose a small patch of brown scalp, gleaming in the morning sun. His remaining hair was bound in leather and brushed the rump of his horse. If elves weren't supposed to age, how old was he really? She turned back to Kale. "Are you a desert elf too?" "No, I am a Yusamor elf from Zuriel." Oh, she should have known that. He wasn't as dark as Saeed, and he didn't have a beard. They urged the horses on to catch up with the guardian and passed a boy smelling smoked fish. At first, he looked like an ordinary boy, except for the V-shaped edging around his forehead, and his skin glimmered in the sun. Short, brown, tousled hair grew from behind the ridge and bounced as he shifted curled seashells and dried fish atop various large wooden barrels. Behind him, a mountain of barrels loomed over him. A man stood on top, tying a rope, securing them to a large wagon. He wore large, floppy boots and a silver vest. Green, feathery fringe grew from his opalescent skin and stretched the length of his arms. He called down to the boy and threw him the end of the rope. Ayianna didn't understand the words, but his voice flowed over them like the sea lapping at the shoreline. The boy craned his neck to look up at the man. The movement revealed 3 faint slits behind his jawline. A kaleki! She couldn't believe it. She had only glimpsed their silvery sails and slick sailing vessels from the cliffs of Zuriel. But here, right in the middle of the plains, were 2 merfolk. What were they doing so far inland? The boy flashed a smile at her. Her face and ears burned. How long had she been staring? She straightened and pressed her heels into the side of the horse. She pulled alongside Kale and rode in silence. The heat in her cheeks subsided, and her thoughts returned to Dagmar and her father. Questions somersaulted in her mind until she could no longer keep quiet. What are we going to do? We? Saeed will see that you are safely returned home. He goaded his horse forward in the ever-crowding streets. She glared at the back of his head. But what about Dagmar and those men hunting me? You'll have protection in your village. Right, like the protection that Dagmar had. My village doesn't even have walls. What happened at Dagmar is none of your concern. None of my concern? Ayianna gripped the edge of the saddle. My brother is dead, burning in a mass pyre. My father's been murdered, his body left for scavengers. Yet you say, he turned, his glare fierce, your brother's death was an unintended casualty, one of many who were killed. He was not the focus. Ayianna bit her lip, fighting back tears. I didn't mean to lessen another's death. But her words were lost to him as he kicked his horse into a trot. She followed after him. He was right. She needed to go home. But what would she find? Her anger dissipated into guilt. It gnawed at her like a dog chewing a bone. Oh, Asarin, protect my mother. Kale halted in front of the stables and dismounted next to Saeed. Ayianna didn't know what to do. Her stomach twisted in knots. She wanted to turn the horse around and ride home. Come now, Ayianna. Saeed glanced up at her. Rushing back to your home would be foolish. She stared at him. How did you know? Your face reveals a great deal. Saeed patted her leg. Now, off you go. Your mount is in need of rest as well. Ayianna slid from her horse and fell to the ground. Don't ride much, do you? Kale offered to help her stand. She brushed his hand aside. I'm fine. She stood and wobbled into the stables, pulling her horse after her. Kale and Saeed followed. Morning, elf folk, a stable boy said. He rubbed his hands on his drab tunic. That'll be 10 dalakies per horse. You 3 look mighty rough this morning. Did you have a run-in with thieves or something? If thieves could do this much damage, then we would all be lost. Saeed counted the dalakies to the boy. What news can you tell me about Badara and her king? Depends on how much that information is worth to you. The boy grinned. He took off his cap and scratched his head. His hair, the color of dirty straw, stood askew. He flattened it and replaced his cap. Well? Kale frowned. We aren't interested in purchasing information that you gathered for free. Your loss. The boy shrugged. He took the reins and led the horses toward the corral. To think we'd have to pay for the latest gossip. Ayianna shook her head. Kale looked past her. Darren will have more information than a mere stable boy. Perhaps, Saeed said. But unlike Darren, wherever the boy goes, no man thinks to guard his tongue in his presence. You would be surprised the information he could gather. Kale turned his attention to Saeed. What are you planning to do? I will seek an audience with King Valdemar. What? Ayianna raised her eyebrows. Looking like that? Saeed gave her a sad half-smile. It would not be so easy for him to dismiss the death of many if I approach looking as if death itself spit me back out. What would you have me do? Kale asked. Find Nevin Darren and tell him what happened. Tell him to alert the other guardians and prepare for an assembly. Saeed tugged a braid as he scanned the crowded streets. He is overseeing the festival preparations. He should not be difficult to find. Kale nodded. What about the girl? She gritted her teeth. The sooner she was away from him, the better. She is in your charge until I have met with the king. Then we will accompany her to her village. I have a few questions I would like to ask her mother. Perhaps she will have some answers. Saeed turned to Ayianna. His eyes softened. And I would not ask anyone to deliver such news as you have to bear alone, my dear. Ayanna's throat nodded, so she nodded her thanks instead. Saeed turned to leave. If all goes well, I shall meet you two this evening in Darren's quarters. Then he stepped into the street and disappeared among the people crowding the market square. Cale rounded on her. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it, clenching his jaw until the vein bulged. She stared at his scuffed-up boots, wishing the ground would suddenly open up and swallow her. He spun around and marched away. She hurried after him. She kept pace for a few strides, then he stopped and faced her. Women walk behind men in the plains, or weren't you aware of that? Ayianna stared at him and then quickly lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. You didn't offend me. You're offending the citizens of Badara. I suppose you haven't lived among the humans long enough for their society to convert your mind. Was it that obvious? Wait, how did he know? She dared a glance at him, and not only did she see his grim face, but also the disapproving looks of those passing by. How am I ever going to adapt to this way of life? She caught sight of the crimson blood staining the sleeve of his ivory tunic. Cale, your arm! He turned away. A scratch. It must have reopened. It will fester if you don't clean it. Then you could get la viacer and lose your arm. We need to take care of that right away. Ayianna pulled him into the first building they came to, a blacksmith shop. Soot blanketed the walls, ceiling, and floor. Flecks of iron clenched underfoot. Coals smoldered in the forge, emitting heat. The smell of hot metal and sulfur saturated the air. In the corner, a burly man hammered away, sparks erupting with each stroke. The blacksmith was just as filthy as his shop. Sweat rolled down his blackened face, and grease and dirt smeared his leather apron. The blacksmith turned and shoved a glowing spike of iron into the coals. "Can I help you?" the man asked as he wiped his hands on his apron, his voice louder than normal, but still friendly. "Could you boil some water?" Ayianna asked. "You'll have to speak up. I'm a little hard of hearing." "Could you boil some water?" Ayianna asked a little louder. "Eh? Hot water!" Ayianna shouted, pointing at Cale's bloody sleeve. The blacksmith nodded and ducked from the room. "This isn't exactly a place for tending wounds." Cale tugged his shirt off and sat on a wooden bench. Several old scars lined his back and chest. She gasped. "What happened to you?" "Run in with pirates." "So you're not a pirate?" "No." She frowned. "Then why?" "Look, I've got things to do." He stood, but she pushed him back down. Warmth flooded her face. She quickly removed her hands and stepped back. "Darren isn't going anywhere." She pulled her gaze from his chest to his arm. A crusty gash cut across his upper arm. The surrounding skin was red and swollen. Fresh blood oozed from the reopened wound. "That is not a scratch. What happened? Are you going to mend my arm or just stare at me?" "I was only inspecting the wound." Ayianna poked the edge of the skin, a little warm to the touch, but not hot. Hopefully she wouldn't have to sew it up. The blacksmith returned with the water and a towel. Ayianna dipped the edge of the towel into the hot water and swirled it about. She dribbled the water into the gash and pressed the cloth against it to soften the dried blood. Cale tightened his jaw but didn't say anything. She continued cleaning as gently as she could while the blacksmith rummaged through his cupboards. He came back and handed her a roll of gauze. She wrapped Cale's arm, and as she tied the ends, a booming voice rang through the air. "Ayianna!" She jumped back, knocking over the water. She scrambled to set the bucket right and keep the hem of her dress dry. A man towered in the doorway, his blue eyes locked coldly on Cale. A shiny burgundy doublet flashed beneath a short black cape. His wavy blonde hair settled around his narrow face. "Desmond." The two men stared at each other, neither saying a word until Desmond turned his attention to Ayianna. "What are you doing here? Look at you! Your face! Your clothes!" Desmond said, his eyes sweeping the height of Ayianna. "Where is your head covering? People will think you're some kind of whore. Rossi!" A young boy dressed in a green tunic and leggings appeared in the doorway. "Bring me a scarf from the wares," Desmond said, and the boy darted from the blacksmith shop. "I'm sorry," Cale stood, "but who are you and what business do you have here?" Desmond rounded on Cale. "Excuse me, but she belongs to me. She is my betrothed." "I don't recall Taryn mentioning that." Ayianna twisted the cold, wet rag in her hands. The elf obviously knew more about her brother than what he had told her. Desmond smiled. "And why would he?" "Have we met before?" Cale asked. "Have you been to Dagmar?" Desmond eyed him before answering. "Possibly." I have passed through Dagmar a time or two. One hardly passes through. I'm sure I would have remembered you. My religious pilgrimages are a private matter. Perhaps you should put your shirt on now and go. Desmond, his name felt strange on her tongue. Cale saved my life. His head snapped in her direction. Saved your life? What were you doing that you needed saving? I was looking for my brother, but Dagmar had been attacked. Her voice choked, but she remained composed and braced herself for what he would say. What possessed you to traipse all over the countryside alone? You know better than that. But there were these people, and my father. Enough, Desmond sighed. Your mother is probably half sick from worrying over you. Yes, Ayianna mumbled. She lowered her eyes as guilt burrowed holes in her resolve. Razi appeared with an orange and yellow banded scarf. Desmond took it and gave it to Ayianna. Chagrined, Ayianna slipped the scarf over her head and around her neck. Desmond turned to Cale. I must repay you for bringing, he cocked his head and then added with emphasis, my betrothed safely to Badara. That won't be necessary, Cale replied, still shirtless. He gave Ayianna a curt nod and stepped out of the blacksmith shop. Ayianna watched him go, longing to ask him questions about her brother, but he vanished amid the growing crowds of people. What is this? Desmond asked. Ayianna turned to catch Desmond's glare settling on Liam. Her name is Liam, and she belongs to me. Right. Well, I have work to do. You can clean up and rest at Cuthbert's Inn. Desmond turned to the blacksmith and added loudly, I'll return later to pick up my uncle's order. Desmond ushered her out of the blacksmith shop and into the scores of people flooding the streets. The exchange of coins rattled in the scales. Bartering voices swelled. Hundreds of people wandered the streets of Badara, trying the wares like cows grazing on a warm summer day. Ayianna's skin crawled as if someone were watching her. She glanced back and sucked in a breath. A tall man in a long black cloak leaned against the blacksmith shop. He shifted his weight, but didn't move. His eyes seemed to follow her every move. But then everyone seemed to be watching her.